Welcome back, detectives. Today we'll be looking at a case that was filed anonymously. This case file involves a man whose wife passes recently, but her old habits come back to haunt him. Beginning audio dramatization for the records in 3, 2, 1. I have a problem with spacing out. I'll just be somewhere and time will escape me. I primarily do this when I'm on the toilet, much to my wife's dismay. I would go in and get my business done and then spend minutes sitting on my phone, blissfully unaware of time slipping by. One day my wife had gone out and pampered herself for the day, haircut, nails, and spa treatment. She came home and I was in the bathroom, spacing out as I do. She wanted to show me the results of her day out and got tired of waiting for me. So she walked to the bathroom door and bent over. Her thin fingers slipped under the crack at the bottom of the door. She wriggled her fingers around like worms escaping from the dirt.
"What do you think?"
she asked playfully, to which I replied that they were beautiful. With the lights of the bathroom creating a visible gloss over the scarlet fingernails, she found her rebuttal to my habits. Every time from here on out that I was caught sitting in the bathroom for too long, I could expect to see her hand slip through the bathroom door. It never failed to make me smile and bring me back to my senses. Sometimes she would tell me to hurry up, or she would pull on the door telling me to let her in. If I was having a rough day, I would go in the bathroom and just sit, waiting until her hand came through the crack. I would reach out and hold it. She had never said anything then. Rough days became more and more commonplace. We were happy together. We would have our issues, but we worked hard to resolve them together. Then something came along that was out of either of our control. The diagnosis was unexpected and swift. We had taken her for a routine checkup, and a week later we got the call. My wife had developed an aggressive cancer that was going to eat away at her. We did everything we could to make her more comfortable, but with how fast the cancer was growing, chemo would have been difficult. It was hard to hear it, but it was her body, and all she wanted was to be as comfortable as possible during the fading hours. I knew I didn't have a lot of time left with her, but still, my visits to the bathroom became more frequent. I would turn the shower on and just let it run so that she didn't have to hear the woe that poured out of me. She knew she could always read me, and when I'd sit on the bathroom floor while the room filled with steam, her fingers would appear. Despite the pain she must have been going through, she would pull herself up from the bed to confront me. Her fingers became a marker for the passage of her last few days. Fingers that were once plush and full of life became thin and fragile. The flesh had started to fade in color and lose its firm appearance. Wrinkles lined her fingers like road maps. When I would reach out to hold them, they felt so cold to the touch. I wanted to give her my warmth more than anything. When we knew the end was near, we bundled her up and took her out for the day. She got all of the fixings she normally would. Her fingernails the same color as the first time she stuck them under the door. She was as beautiful as ever. I held her hand that night. I swear I could feel her leaving. The feeling of her hand changed. Her breath slowed and we said our final words to each other. And that was that. She was gone. It didn't matter where I was after that. The time had stopped mattering to me. It was difficult enough to stay awake. Losing her was like falling into a waking coma. My eyes were open, but my body refused to move. I collected days of sorrow together until they became weeks. Slowly, I was able to get out of bed and return to the waking world. I cleaned the house that had fallen into disarray after her passing. I worked hard dissolving the relationship I had established with alcohol. The sun started to shine a little brighter as I was able to move on from the loss and carry forward with her in my heart. Things had returned to normal. Well, as normalized as they could have been, and I found myself falling back into old habits. My legs would go numb in the toilet as I scrolled through various social media sites. Sometimes I half expected to move my phone and see her fingers under the door. There was a sliver of somber silence in my heart every time I saw the empty, black space under the bathroom door. This somber silence transformed into an intense confusion when I looked down and swore for a brief moment something was poking out of the crack. I blinked in disbelief, and when my eyes had opened again, it was empty. I even went as far as to stand up and pull the door open. I knew I was the only person in the house, but I had the sensation I wasn't alone. I leaned out the door and peeked down the hallway. It was as empty as it had ever been. I thought that perhaps the grief I was feeling had momentarily manifested into a trick of the light. This would happen every so often. Days would go by without it being a problem, but it seemed like every time I caught a glimpse, it would happen more rapidly. I'd see a shape out of the corner of my eye, and by the time I shifted my gaze to meet it head on, it would disappear. I would try and sit, just staring at the blank space, but nothing would happen. It continued like this for another few weeks. My heart became fuller, and the memories of sorrow that related to her had turned into those of joy. Our best days together were the ones that my mind would always wander to. I thought that I was ready to move on, that I could start my life over somewhere away from the pain of it all, until I finally caught a glance at what I had been seeing. I was sitting in the bathroom when the visual oddity returned, only when I turned my head, it didn't vanish. Staring in complete disbelief, my heart fluttered something awful. Poking in from under the door were 4 plump and healthy fingers. My breath became so difficult to catch as I watched the familiar fingers wriggling around. They looked like fish that had been thrown onto dry land, the deep red fingernails occasionally tapping against the tiled floor or the wooden door. I rose slowly from the seat and placed my hand on the doorknob. I was at such a loss for words, I could only think about seeing what was on the other side. Slowly, I pulled the door open and once again faced with an empty hallway, the brown carpet stretching out into the dark living room. The darkness was like a void calling me, soft glowing light from the bathroom vanishing into the night. I backed up and swung the door shut again. It felt heavy as my eyes focused on the floor. There was nothing there. The fingers that I thought I saw fled the scene. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. They knew what a hard time I had after the passing of my wife, and I was worried I'd be thrown into a hospital if I started going on about seeing my wife again. Instead, I walked away from it hoping the hallucination would be a one-and-done type ordeal, that I could just ignore it and not have to worry about it. Every time I sat down to use the bathroom and ended up losing track of time, her phantom fingers would appear. Always dressed up, red fingernails and healthy-looking digits would curl over and over like they were beckoning me. I tried to ignore them, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I was perplexed, but I didn't see the harm in it. Sure, it was a delusion, but it wasn't hurting me, and it was a chance to be reminded of when she was healthy. I even started to purposely stay in the room until they appeared like I used to. If that's all that happened, her fingers under the door, I would have let it go. The ignorance I was feigning was chipped away at when I was watching the fingers of my deceased wife sliding into the bathroom door. The 4 digits made their way in, and much to my horror, so did a second set of fingers. This set of 4 was thicker. The knuckles had wrinkles that reminded me of the inside of a tree. The fingernails were cracked and dark brown hair was visible near the joints. I was taken aback, once again ushered to silence by the strange occurrence. I don't know why, but I called out to the fingers. When my voice fills the bathroom, they seemed to stop in their tracks, unmoving for a moment until they curled up and started to grip the door. I could see the door starting to bend and could hear the wood creak. I reached forward and turned the handle, quickly pulling the door open as I watched the fingers retreat into the ether. Sitting alone at night, with my pants around my ankles, I tried my best to stay calm. It was crazy. I knew from the start it was crazy, but when I saw the second set of fingers, ones I didn't recognize, I couldn't just shove it away. My hand pressed against the door and felt the wood until I reached the bottom. Where the fingers had made contact with the door had become noticeably colder than the rest. Once again, and as foolishly as ever, I shrugged it off with a heavy denial. I lived alone, so I just started to leave the doors of my home open. It's a hard habit to break, though. Closing doors where you are conditioned to want privacy is just something you naturally do. So I every so often would shut the door, hearing the click of the doorknob, and wouldn't think anything of it. A grim reminder would be staring me in the face when I would look down to see a cacophony of fingers fighting for space under the door. No longer was it just the fingers of my late wife, no. Whenever the door was shut and I lost track of time, the door would become littered with unfamiliar and squirming fingers. Some were different skin tones, others had scars lining them. Each and every set of fingers were different, and every time I saw them there would be new ones. I wanted to kick at them, but I would halt myself at the thought of them being able to physically interact with the door. Laying in bed at night, I couldn't get the sound of those fingernails tapping against the door out of my head. It was like I was in an office building listening to worker bees. When I thought about the door itself, I figured it was the key. Closing the door was a habit, but it was one I couldn't indulge in if there wasn't a door. The day after that thought crossed my mind, I got up and rummaged through the toolbox that she had bought me, even though I wasn't much of a handyman. It had been dormant for so long that when I opened it, it got stuck halfway. I reached into the small opening and pulled a few select tools out. I pressed the screwdriver to the hinges and worked away at them until freeing the door from its frame. Setting the door against the wall, I let out a sigh of relief, one that was cut short as I heard an all too familiar chorus. My head turned slowly, and with the bright rays of the sun puncturing the living room windows, I saw a collection of fingers moving from within the small crack of the toolbox. The fingers themselves were noticeably smaller, almost as if they had scaled down to the smaller space allotted by the toolbox. Still, they wriggled away. I lifted my foot and brought it down hard on the top of the toolbox. A large clang rang out when it slammed shut. Looking down, I saw the fingers had retreated, but the natural light pouring in highlighted thin trails of translucent smoke rising from the toolbox. One blink is all it took for the fingers to find somewhere new to appear. When my eyes opened and the living room was once again in my sights, I could feel my heart sink to my feet. The fingers looked normal under the door. They were smaller when they poked out of the toolbox, and when they crawled out from under the couch, they were massive. Each digit could have been the size of my arm as they articulated and pushed down on the cushions. I backed away, watching the frightening display in front of me. The light from the sun seemed to be swallowed up by darkness under the couch. An unending black the fingers brought with them. Half expecting to see eyes peering back at me from the darkness, I averted my gaze. I could still hear them moving. The large thumping sounds like pile of laundry hitting the floor continued to come from the living room. I stood and waited until the noise had stopped, and upon turning around, I noticed they were gone. Hastily, I headed to the front door and made my escape from my home. I thought that exiting where she used to live would be enough, but as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I saw them everywhere. I stood in the ominously silent outdoors as fingers poked out from under garbage bins and from the cracked windows of the houses around me. They were even prodding out from the undersides of cars as they drove by like giant mechanical centipedes. It would have been borderline cartoonish if it wasn't so powerfully ghoulish. No matter where I looked, if there was an opening, they were there. Not knowing what to do and seeing that a number of them were poking out of my parked car and from the thin spaces in the sidewalk, I retreated into my home. Uncertain, I stumbled through the house, fingers poking out from under the microwave and out of the couch once more. Eventually, my stumbling brought me back to the bathroom where it all started. The door laid on the wall, my fingers braced on the cold white sink, and I stared hard at myself in the mirror. I wondered if I had lost my mind completely, if the grief of losing my wife truly had driven me to insanity. That's when I felt a gentle tickle, a small sensation of pressure on the sides of my head. Turning slowly, I was just barely able to see my ear in the mirror. I hadn't noticed then that I couldn't hear the tapping of the fingers anymore. I couldn't hear anything other than the faint scratching of fingernails against the skin. The tiny collection of fingers clogging up the openings of my ears being the cause. My own finger hovered momentarily by the ear. Hand shaking, I quickly shoved my finger into the ear and twisted. I could feel my own fingernail tearing away at my skin. The sensation was still there, and I tried to dig deeper and deeper to get at it, but every time I managed to scratch the itch, the feeling would retreat further back. When I pulled my finger back out, I looked at the small collection of blood at the end of it and under my fingernails. there were fucking fingers sticking out of the gap between my finger and the nail. I could feel the itch everywhere. All through my body, small internal pressure emitted and confused. My eyes landed on the screwdriver laying on the bathroom sink, a small beacon of hope laid framed by the white. My throat, the air was hard to take in. Once more I looked in the mirror. In my reflection, I could see myself trembling. The feeling of worms inside of me masked anything my other senses should have picked up. My own fingers wrapped around the plastic handle of the screwdriver as my mouth became slack and open. Fingers were reaching out like someone was trapped inside my body and they were frantically trying to get out. That's the last thing I could see as the cylindrical shadows started to cover my view. I can never attempt to explain how it felt to have the fingers pressuring open my eyelids and resting in front of my vision. It didn't hurt. It was like my eyes were being clawed out from the inside. The grip tightened. I don't know if I had slipped completely, but I swore I could feel them tapping away from the grooves of my brain. Gentle fingers pushing my soft gray matter. Through it all, like a zombie, I lifted the screwdriver and walked back to the door. I pulled it from the wall and gathered the hinges. As I did, the sensations lingering from the fingers started to disappear, and as I screwed the door back into place, they vanished from my vision. My hearing returned, and I was able to breathe clearly. It took a moment, as my body was still in disarray, and my mind was wrecked, but the door was locked back into place. I swung it shut and sat on the toilet. I sat in silence, and my mind wandered, losing track of time. Eventually, I was pulled back to reality as I watched 4 fingers creeping their way through the door. I stood from the toilet and turned to put my back against the wall next to the door. Slowly, I buckled my knees until I was sitting on the floor. I looked at the fingers. They were gray and full of wrinkling imperfections, but I could tell by the ring. It was hers. I picked up the screwdriver in my right hand and, wielding it like a sword, I felt the heft of its metal.
What do you think?
I heard a soft and distant voice slipping from under the door like so many fingers had before. Like a spider, the tips of my fingers crawled across the patterned tile floor towards her hand. The cold stained the back of my hand as it rested on the tiles. It wasn't as strange as I feared it would be when her fingers locked with mine. They felt just like hers. They were her hands, and she must have grown so tired of waiting for me. "They're beautiful," I replied, and with a sharp movement that offered no chance for a second thought, I plunged the Phillips head screwdriver hard into the side of my head. My eyes twitched for a moment, and my body started to slump. Trails of warm red liquid seeped out and ran down the side of my face until they began soaking my shoulder. It became harder to see her hand as my vision started to blur, but I could feel it. I knew she was there with me as I finally opened the last door. She wanted me to, so we could be together again. As this case was filed anonymously, it's hard to get any further details or even confirm its validity, but if it's in the records, I have to. The hell was that?
Let me in.